August 23, 1305. London gathers for a spectacle of pure horror. A man is dragged through the streets, blood marking every stone, chains cutting into his flesh. But this is no ordinary criminal. This is William Wallace, the rebel giant who defied the most powerful king in Europe. His death was meant to crush Scotland forever, yet it sparked a fire that still burns 7 centuries later. Stay with me, because Wallace's final moments are only the beginning of his legend. Section 1. The morning sky above London is the color of ash, a heavy gray that hangs low over the city like a funeral shroud. August 23, 1305. A date that will not be forgotten, though the men and women gathering in the streets scarcely realize the weight of what they are about to witness. They come not for worship, not for trade, but for a spectacle of cruelty that promises to outshine all others. The sound reaches you before the sight. The slow, uneven drag of wood across stone. The clatter of hooves striking the cobblestones. And beneath it all, that sickening scrape, the dull rasp of torn flesh being ground against the city's bones. Mothers hold their children up to see. Merchants abandon their stalls, leaving loaves of bread half-sliced and coins unattended. Nobles peer down from balconies draped in banners. London, for one grim morning, is united in bloodlust. At last the crowd splits open, the mass of bodies bending aside like stalks before a storm. Gasps ripple outward. Bound naked to a wooden hurdle, wrists and ankles lashed to rough planks, William Wallace is dragged forward by a horse that shows no more concern for its burden than if it were hauling timber. The man who once led armies, who stood against the mightiest king in Europe, is delivered like cargo. But even broken, Wallace commands attention. His body tells the story of his torment, skin shredded from the long, punishing journey south, muscles torn and bruised, ribs jutting sharp against pale flesh. His back is a lattice of whip scars and open wounds. Blood cakes his hair and clings in dark rivulets to his jaw. And yet, his eyes. Those who meet them falter, even in their hatred. For they do not see surrender. They see fire. A boy on his father's shoulders tugs at his sleeve. Is that him? The giant? The man nods, his mouth tight. Aye. That's Wallace. God help him. Spittle, stones, and handfuls of filth are hurled from the mob, striking Wallace's battered form. He does not flinch. His gaze lifts skyward, to that colorless sky, as though even now he dares to measure himself not against the men jeering at him, but against heaven itself. And somewhere in the crowd, among the laughter and the curses, a voice whispers almost too softly to hear. Freedom! The horse lurches forward, and Wallace is dragged towards Smithfield. His last stage. Section 2. Long before London streets tasted his blood, William Wallace was nothing more than a boy chasing shadows across the rolling fields of Elderslie. The year was 1270, and Scotland lay wrapped in a peace so steady it seemed eternal. Farmers tended their crops with steady rhythm, markets thrummed with life, and King Alexander III's hand rested firmly upon the crown. Few could imagine the storms that loomed on the horizon. Sir Malcolm Wallace, William's father, was no great lord. A minor landowner, his wealth was counted in acres of tilled earth, and the cattle grazing them. Yet within his modest hall burned a fierce devotion to Scotland. Land can be taken, William, he once told his young son, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. But a man's honor, only he can surrender that. From the start, William was different. He grew faster than his brothers, towering over other boys his age by the time he could grip a sword. His strength was matched by a restless mind. Where others laughed at Latin sermons or dozed through lessons with the monks, William drank them in, reciting prayers in Latin and puzzling out old Roman tales by candlelight. His uncle, a priest named Crawford, often remarked, "This one will raise either a sword or a nation. Perhaps both." The countryside offered him his first battles. Wooden sticks clashed in mock duels. Bruises were worn proudly as badges. William's laughter, booming and bright, carried across the hills. Again! He would roar, even as sweat poured down his brow, challenging boys 2 years his senior. One evening, as the family gathered by the hearth, his mother asked. And what would you do, my son, if the English came upon us with their soldiers and their taxes? William, only 10 years old, straightened as though the question had been meant for a grown man. I'd stand before them, he said, eyes alight, and tell them Scotland bows to no one. The adults chuckled, but his father did not. Instead, Sir Malcolm studied his son with a quiet pride, and perhaps a flicker of fear. For even in times of peace, every Scot knew peace was a fragile thing. And so William grew, the giant in the making. Strong enough to wrestle 3 lads to the dirt, yet gentle enough to help his mother carry water from the well. Fierce in games of sword and chase, yet endlessly curious about the world beyond the village. To those who knew him then, he was simply young Wallace, a boy with broad shoulders and an unshakable will. But destiny had already fixed its gaze upon him. Section 3. The village of Elderslie was a quiet place, where gossip spread faster than the wind and every face was familiar. Yet William's world was larger than thatched roofs and muddy lanes. His uncle, the priest Crawford, took him often to Paisley Abbey, where monks in heavy robes taught him letters and scripture. There, among the smell of ink and parchment, William discovered that words were weapons sharper than steel. Read this, boy, Crawford urged one winter evening, sliding a worn manuscript across the table. The Latin was dense, filled with strange names of long-dead Romans. William struggled, his tongue tripping over syllables. But when he deciphered the tale of a people throwing off the chains of tyrants, his eyes lit like embers. They fought for freedom, he whispered, the word lingering on his lips as though it had always belonged to him. Yet lessons were not confined to books. Outside the abbey, the land itself trained him. He stalked deer through whispering forests, learning silence and patience. He sparred with older lads, their laughter turning to grunts of effort as his strength grew. By 16, he could wield a long sword so heavy most men used 2 hands. The villagers began to call him the big lad Wallace, half in jest, half in awe. But peace never lasts. Whispers of English officials, of new taxes and harsher laws, began to reach even the secluded valleys. One spring, soldiers rode through Elderslie to collect grain. Their leader, a sneering man with polished armor, declared the levy doubled. Farmers pleaded, women wept, but the soldiers only laughed. William, not yet 20, stood among the villagers. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. When a soldier struck an old farmer to the ground, William stepped forward. Enough, he growled. The officer wheeled his horse. And what will you do, boy? Silence held the square. William's heart thundered, his hand itching for the hilt of his blade. But his father's voice rang in his memory. Honor may call for defiance, but wisdom demands patience. So William lowered his gaze. The soldiers, smirking, rode off with their plunder. But that day carved something deep within him. A wound not of flesh, but of spirit. He would never forget the sight of proud Scots bowed under foreign boots. That night by the hearth, he spoke to his father. "Duh," he said softly. "Why do we let them do this?" Sir Malcolm's face, lined by years of toil and care, grew grim. "Because, son, the storm has not yet broken. But it will. And when it does, you must be ready." William did not sleep that night. He stared into the darkness, imagining chains breaking, imagining a land unshackled. He did not yet know how much blood that vision would demand. Section 4. In March of 1286, fate struck Scotland like a lightning bolt. King Alexander III, the pillar of stability, rode through the storm-lashed night toward Queen Yolande at Kinghorn. No one knows if it was haste, a misstep, or the wrath of the storm itself, but his horse stumbled near the cliffs, and the king was dashed upon the rocks below. The news spread like fire across the land. One day Scotland had a wise, steady king, the next she had a void. In Elderslie, William listened as his father spoke grimly with neighbors. "The king is dead," Sir Malcolm said, his voice low. "And his heir is a child, a bairn in Norway who's never set foot in Scotland." "Then who will lead us?" one man asked. Sir Malcolm shook his head. "That's the danger. When there is no one strong at the helm, vultures circle. The child Queen Margaret, Maid of Norway, became the nation's fragile hope. For 4 years, regents governed in her stead, balancing ambition and fear. The nobles schemed, alliances frayed, and Scotland seemed to hold its breath. William, now growing into his immense height and strength, trained harder than ever, as though he could already sense that the storm his father warned of was gathering. But when Margaret died in 1290 on her voyage to Scotland, that breath was released in a shuddering gasp. The throne was empty, the crown contested, and whispers of civil war filled the air. It was then that the Scottish lords made a fateful decision. To prevent bloodshed among themselves, they invited Edward I of England, Longshanks, to arbitrate between the claimants to the throne. William heard the name for the first time in a hushed conversation between his father and Uncle Crawford. "Edward Longshanks," Malcolm muttered. "A man with arms like spears and ambition to match. He conquered Wales. He won't settle for choosing a king here. He'll want the crown for himself. He'll dress it as law." Crawford agreed, bitterness in his voice. "But it'll be conquest all the same." And so it was. Edward chose John Balliol, a weak man more puppet than monarch. He demanded homage, forced the nobles to sign the Ragman Roll, and treated Scotland as a vassal state. William saw the changes with his own eyes. English sheriffs took charge of towns. Taxes doubled. Lands were handed to English knights. His father spat in the dirt whenever a Red Cross banner passed. One evening, William sat sharpening his blade by the fire. His father watched him in silence before speaking. "You've grown tall, lad. Strong. But strength alone won't win what's coming. You'll need fire in your heart, and patience in your bones. Remember that." William nodded, though his eyes betrayed the storm raging within him. For he had already begun to imagine a Scotland that bowed to no foreign king. And Edward Longshanks, though far away, had already cast his shadow over William Wallace's life. Section 5. The year was 1296, and Edward Longshanks' decided patience had run its course. John Balliol, Scotland's puppet king, had dared to resist, forming fragile alliances with France and declaring Scotland's independence. Edward's response was swift and merciless, an avalanche of steel pouring north. Berwick-upon-Tweed was the first to suffer. Once a bustling port, filled with merchants shouting prices and ships crowding its harbor, it became a tomb in a single day. English banners rose above the walls, and Edward's soldiers flooded the streets with fire and blood. Chroniclers would later write of it in horror: 17,000 dead, men butchered in the alleys, women cut down as they fled, even babes torn from their mothers' arms. Streets ran so thick with blood that boots sloshed as if through mud. "God abandoned Berwick," one monk recorded, "and the crows feasted for weeks." News of the slaughter reached Elderslie. William's fists clenched until his knuckles whitened as a traveler described the smoke still rising from the ruined port. Around the hearth, his family sat in silence. His younger brother Malcolm asked, voice trembling, "Could they do that here?" Sir Malcolm's gaze hardened. "Aye, lad. They could. And they will, unless men stand against them." William rose, towering, his jaws set. "Then let them come. Better to die on our feet than crawl on our knees." But for all his fury, rebellion was no simple choice. To resist Edward was to court death, not just for oneself but for kin, for village, for all who harbored rebels. Wallace trained in secret, honing his swordplay, his bow, and his strength. The monks still tutored him in Latin and Scripture, but he now saw those words differently. When he read of the Maccabees rising against foreign oppressors, he whispered the lines aloud as though they were prophecy. Not all Scots resisted. Many nobles bent the knee, some out of fear, others for coin and land. Wallace watched them, his contempt growing. "They wear chains as if they were jewels," he muttered to his uncle one evening. "Careful, lad," Crawford warned. "Defiance has ears everywhere. The English will hear your words before the wind dies." But William could not be silenced. Each injustice, the grain stolen, the taxes doubled, the neighbors whipped for speaking out, added another ember to the fire in his chest. And then, in Lanark, that fire roared into open flame. The sheriff, William Heselrig, ruled with cruelty sharpened by arrogance. Tales whispered of beatings, of women dishonored, of men imprisoned for refusing to bow. One tale struck Wallace to the bone, the murder of Marion Braidfute, a woman some claimed he loved, others that she was kin. Whatever the truth, her death was a blade through his heart. The night after, Wallace did not return to Elderslie. Instead, he gathered a small band of men in the shadows. Enough, he told them, voice low but fierce. No more tribute. No more chains. Tonight we strike back. And with that, William Wallace stepped across a line from which there was no return. Section 6. Lanark slept beneath a pale moon, its streets quiet save for the occasional bark of a dog or the creak of a shutter in the wind. But in the shadows, William Wallace moved like a man possessed. A dozen companions followed him, farmers, blacksmiths, and lads scarcely old enough to grow a beard, all armed with whatever steel or wood they could find. Wallace's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, a great blade nearly as tall as a man. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. Tonight justice would not be begged for, it would be taken. They reached the sheriff's hall, where torchlight flickered through high windows. Inside, William Heselrig feasted, his laughter loud and cruel, echoing through the beams. Wallace's breath came slow and steady as he raised his hand, signaling silence. He whispered, "For Scotland! For Marion!" The door splintered beneath their assault. Wallace was the first through, a storm made flesh. His sword sang through the smoky air, cutting down the first guard before the man even drew breath to shout. Chaos erupted, men scrambling for weapons, servants shrieking, the sheriff rising in fury. Heselrig's eyes met Wallace's, and for a heartbeat the hall froze. The sheriff sneered, his hand going to his blade. "So the outlaw dares." Wallace's voice was low, guttural. "Aye. And the outlaw will end you." They clashed in the center of the hall, steel shrieking against steel. Heselrig was skilled, but Wallace fought with something more than skill. He fought with rage, with grief, with a fury sharpened by years of watching his people broken. Blow after blow rained down, until at last Wallace's sword bit through armor and bone. The sheriff staggered, eyes wide, and fell to the rushes with a gurgling cry. For a moment, silence reigned. Then Wallace turned, blood on his blade, and shouted to the men, "Let it be known! No English tyrant rules here. Scotland's sons bow to no king but their own." The hall erupted in cheers, their voices carrying into the night. Fires were lit, chains broken, prisoners freed. The people of Lanark woke to the sound of rebellion, and the name William Wallace. By dawn, Heselrig's corpse lay cold, and the English garrison had fled or been cut down. Word spread faster than fire on dry heather. In every tavern, every market, whispers grew, "Wallace has risen. He has slain the sheriff. He has defied Longshanks himself." Men began to vanish from their fields and workshops, slipping away to the forests. Some carried spears, others nothing but clubs or scythes. They came because, at last, someone had struck the first blow. And in the heart of every Scot who heard the tale, something stirred, a question long buried: if Wallace can defy them, why not us? Section 7. The forests of Clydesdale became William Wallace's first kingdom. Beneath the thick canopy of oak and pine men gathered. Farmers abandoning their plows, craftsmen leaving half-finished wares upon their benches, even a few disillusioned knights who had grown weary of bending the knee to Edward's sheriffs. They came ragged, hungry, armed with whatever they could carry. But they came willingly, their eyes burning with the same fire that had taken root in Wallace's. At first, they were little more than a mob. Arguments flared over food, over leadership, over whether it was madness to stand against England's might. Wallace silenced them not with threats, but with vision. Around a campfire one night, he stood, towering above the men, his great sword glinting in the flames. "Listen well," he said, his voice steady, carrying through the trees. "We are not thieves, nor outlaws, nor bandits skulking in shadows. We are Scots. And Scots do not live on their knees. Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Wallace raised his hand for silence. We fight not for coin. We fight not for glory. We fight for freedom, freedom for every man, woman, and child who calls this land home. And if we must die to win it, then we will die as free men, not slaves. The words struck like hammer on steel. Men who had doubted now clenched their fists, nodding fiercely. A blacksmith named Hamish bellowed, Aye. Better to die with a sword in hand than live another day under English boot. And so Wallace's ragged band began to transform. He drilled them with patience, teaching them discipline. Wooden poles became pikes, sharpened and hardened in fire. Farmers learned to stand in a schiltron, a bristling wall of spears. Scouts prowled the woods, warning of English patrols. Their first skirmish came swiftly. A convoy of English soldiers, escorting wagons heavy with grain stolen from nearby villages, wound its way along a narrow forest path. Wallace and his men watched from the ridge, hidden among the trees. Tonight, Wallace whispered, crouched beside Hamish, the English learn that Scotland is no easy prize. At his signal, rocks and arrows rained down. Horses reared, men shouted in confusion, and Wallace's rebels surged from the trees with a roar. The battle was brutal and short. English soldiers, outnumbered and panicked, fell beneath pikes and axes. Wallace himself cleaved through their ranks like a force of nature, his sword rising and falling with merciless precision. When the last enemy lay dead or fled, Wallace ordered the wagons turned back. Grain and supplies were returned to the villages. He stood in the square, handing out loaves with his own hands. This is what we fight for, he told them. Not plunder. Not revenge. For Scotland's people. Word spread again, faster this time. Wallace was no common brigand, he was a leader, a champion. A man who struck fear into English hearts, yet gave bread to his people. The forest swelled with recruits. What had begun as a handful of desperate men was becoming an army. And Edward Longshanks would soon hear their footsteps. Section 8. By the summer of 1297, William Wallace's name had spread across Scotland like wildfire. In taverns from Aberdeen to Ayr, his deeds were told in hushed, excited tones. Mothers comforted children by whispering, Wallace fights for us. Farmers, beaten down by English taxes, spoke of him as if he were a spirit summoned from the hills, a giant who struck where least expected and vanished like smoke. But not all welcomed his rise. In the halls of Scotland's nobility, where long tables groaned beneath silver platters and voices echoed in stone chambers, Wallace was spoken of with suspicion. He's a commoner, muttered one laird pacing before the fire. No lands, no titles. What right has he to raise an army? A dangerous man, another added. Men flock to him like flies to honey. He'll bring Edward's wrath down on all of us. Yet none of their scorn silenced the truth. Wallace was succeeding where they had failed. While many nobles bent the knee to Edward, Wallace defied him openly, and lived. In the forests his army swelled. Poor men came in droves, but so too did disillusioned knights and lesser lords. Andrew Moray, a young nobleman whose own lands had suffered under English hands, rode into Wallace's camp one dusk. He dismounted, tall and lean, his mail glinting in the fading light. You are Wallace? He asked, his tone cautious. William rose from the fire where he had been sharpening his blade. He stood head and shoulders above Moray, a mountain of a man, scarred and broad. I, he said simply. Moray studied him, then extended a hand. Then I am glad to fight beside you. Scotland needs more than noble titles. She needs men willing to bleed for her. The two clasped forearms, a bond forged in that moment. Wallace, who had long borne the weight of leadership alone, felt the strength of an ally at last. Together they began to plan something larger than raids and ambushes. The English garrisons had grown wary, traveling in larger forces, fortifying towns. If Scotland was to rise, the rebels would need more than skirmishes. They would need a victory, a great, undeniable triumph to prove that Edward's war machine was not invincible. That chance came at Stirling. The river Forth wound lazily beneath a narrow wooden bridge, overlooked by the crag of Abbey Craig. There, an English army under John de Warenne and Hugh de Cressingham gathered, 15,000 strong, with knights clad in steel, infantry bristling with weapons, and banners snapping in the wind. Opposing them, Wallace and Moray, with perhaps 6,000 men, many armed with little more than pikes and courage. On the eve of battle, the Scottish camp was tense. Fires flickered, men whispered prayers, and the smell of damp earth clung to the air. Wallace moved among them, clasping shoulders, speaking words of fire. One lad, no more than 16, clutched a spear so tightly his knuckles whitened. "Sir Wallace," he stammered, "how can we fight them? They're too many." Wallace knelt so his fierce eyes met the boy's. "Numbers don't win battles, lad. Courage does. The English march proud, thinking us sheep. Tomorrow, we show them Scotland breeds wolves." At that, the boy's fear turned to fierce determination. Across the camp, men lifted their heads, listening to Wallace's booming voice. "Remember this," he thundered. "We fight not for kings, not for nobles, but for freedom. And freedom belongs to all who dare claim it." The cry went up from every throat. "Freedom!" The hills echoed with it, carrying the promise of what was to come. And as dawn crept across the land, Wallace's army prepared to face the storm. Section 9. The Trap at Stirling. The dawn of September 11th, 1297, was heavy with mist, the river Forth glimmering like dull silver beneath a pale sky. Across the bridge, the English army stretched in glittering ranks, knights in polished armor, infantry with banners snapping in the wind, the sheer weight of them enough to crush a smaller nation into dust. But Wallace did not see invincibility. He saw arrogance. He and Andrew Moray watched from the high ground of Abbey Craig as the English began their slow crossing of the wooden bridge. The span was narrow, only wide enough for 2 horsemen abreast. Wallace's eyes narrowed, patient as a hawk. "Not yet," he murmured, as line after line marched across. Moray, standing beside him, asked softly, "How many before we strike?" Wallace's lips curled into a grim smile. "Enough to divide them. Then we cut them down like wheat." Hours passed. The bridge groaned under the weight of thousands, but only half the English army had crossed when Wallace raised his great sword high, sunlight glinting from its steel. "Now!" he roared. The Scots surged forward with a cry that shook the earth. Spears leveled, axes raised, they poured down the slope like a torrent of fury. The English vanguard, trapped between the Scots and the narrow bridge, had no room to maneuver. Horses bucked in panic, knights shouted orders that vanished in the din, and chaos erupted. Wallace's men struck with precision. Spears pierced horse and rider alike, arrows rained from the flanks, and the bridge became a death trap as panicked soldiers tried to flee. Many leapt into the Forth, dragged down by their armor, their cries silenced beneath the current. In the midst of the slaughter, Wallace fought like a storm. His blade rose and fell, each strike felling an enemy. Blood slicked his arms, his voice booming above the clash. "Press them, lads! Drive them into the river!" Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland, fell in the melee, his body hacked apart in the fury of vengeance. The sight drove the Scots into a frenzy, and by day's end, the English vanguard lay shattered, their dead carpeting the riverbank. When the survivors fled, the air rang with the roar of victory. Against impossible odds, Wallace and Moray had triumphed. Scotland, for the first time in memory, had stood toe-to-toe with England, and won. That night, fires blazed across the camp. Men danced, sang, and wept openly. Wallace, seated apart, stared into the flames. Moray, weary but smiling, sat beside him. "We've done the impossible, William." Wallace shook his head slowly. "Nay, Andrew. We've only begun. Edward will not forgive this. He will come, and when he does, he'll bring hell itself." But in his heart he knew Scotland would never be the same again. Section 10. Betrayal, Death, and Immortality. The triumph at Stirling Bridge made Wallace guardian of Scotland, but glory is a fickle crown. Nobles who once ignored him now whispered behind his back, Some envied his power, others feared his defiance. Even Robert the Bruce, not yet the hero he would become, hesitated in the shadows of loyalty and ambition. In July 1298, Edward Longshanks returned. At Falkirk, English longbows tore Wallace's army apart. The ground was slick with Scottish blood, and Wallace, though he escaped, was forced to resign his guardianship. From that day forward, he became a man hunted, his face known to every soldier, his name cursed in every English campfire tale. Yet he never yielded. For years he moved in secret, striking where he could, vanishing into forests and hills. He sought aid in France, even from the Pope, but betrayal stalked his steps. In 1305, it came at last. John Menteith, a fellow Scot, sold him to the English for gold. Dragged in chains to London, Wallace was paraded as a trophy. At Westminster Hall, he stood before his accusers. The charges were read: treason, sacrilege, murder. Wallace's voice thundered through the chamber. "I could never be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. I owe him no allegiance. He is not my king." The words sealed his fate. On August 23, 1305, at Smithfield, Wallace met his end. Dragged naked through the streets, jeered at by crowds, he endured the ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most brutal death England could devise. His body was torn apart, his head spiked above London Bridge, his limbs scattered to Scotland's towns as a warning. And yet, Edward's triumph was hollow. For the execution meant to shatter Scotland's spirit instead gave it fire. Wallace's name became a battle cry. His defiance lived on in Robert the Bruce, in the men who fought at Bannockburn, in the Declaration of Arbroath, in every Scot who refused to bow. Centuries later, his story still stirs the blood. His body may have been broken, scattered to the winds, but his spirit became immortal, woven into the very soul of Scotland. For Wallace taught his people, and the world, a truth no king could unmake: freedom is worth any price. And in the silence that followed his last breath, the word that had lived on his lips still echoed, soft but unbroken: freedom.